Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera and a very good evening, everyone. My name is Latifah Hassan. I'm a veterinary public health epidemiologist from University Putra Malaysia and Malaysia One Health University Network. Welcome to Trop Science 2021 panel discussion on challenges of the tropics. The theme for today's discussion is One Health in Action, Tales of Emerging Pathogens and Things to Come. We are extremely fortunate today to have four prominent experts in emerging pathogens with us for this conversation. Let me quickly introduce them to you. Our panelists for today are high-impact scientists and have received multiple international recognitions and accolades. They led and are leading some of the more recent emerging disease research and discoveries. They serve in various advisory or consultation capacities in various international governing bodies and agencies. They are amongst those in the forefront with latest work in global emerging pathogens. We have with us today Prof. John Mackenzie, MSA Laureate 2005, who is the Premier's Fellow and Professor of Tropical Infectious Diseases at the Division of Health Sciences, Curtin University of Technology, Australia. Welcome, Prof. Professor Malik Paris, MSc Laureate 2007, Chair of Virology at the School of Public Health, the University of Hong Kong. Thank you for being with us. Professor David Heyman, Medical Epidemiologist and Professor of Infectious Disease Epidemiology of London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and is a Distinguished Fellow at the Center of Universal Health at Chatham House. And finally, Professor Wang Limfa. He is the Director in the Program of Emerging Infectious Diseases at Duke NUS Medical School. Welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today. I'm very excited to be the moderator for this session, and it's quite a privilege for me to be here. Before we begin, for the benefit of those new to One Health is a concept that emphasizes the interconnectivity of human, animal, and ecosystem health. It is an approach that promotes collaboration, partnership, and communication in solving complex problems. And indeed, emerging diseases is a very complex problem. Sustainable Development Goal by the United Nations, goal number 17, is partnership and collaboration to achieve the other 16 goals. So that just enforces how important One Health approach is. But One Health approach has been around for at least a century. Old concept that has been in the past decade re-emphasized because of many different events that's happening around the globe. So for today, we will spend the first quarter of the session listening to each of the panelists about their personal experiences on One Health efforts before we move on to the interactive conversation between you, audience, and then and the panelists. As a reminder, please type your question on the platform using Slido function or in the chat box that has been provided by the organizer. I will certainly get to those during the Q&A session. So without further ado, we're going to move on to the tales of emerging pathogens. I know that we only give you 10 minutes to speak about your experiences, and that's not going to be enough. But I think it's enough to as a discussion point. So we'll start off with Professor David Heyman. Go ahead, Professor David Heyman, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Latifah. It's a real pleasure to be with you, to be speaking with you, because really the veterinarians understand One Health much better than do those dealing with human health. But hopefully, through some discussions today, we can make sure that the human medicine side is also understanding the importance of One Health. What I'm going to do is talk about two experiences that I've had or that I've been associated with over the past years. Next slide. And I just start by taking you back to the former Zaire in 1976, to a mission hospital, which you see along this dirt road in the tropical rainforest of DRC. Next. This mission hospital was run by Belgian missionary sisters, and you can see them on the left in their New Year's greetings in 1976. And on the right, you can see the maternity at their hospital in the Yambuku Mission Hospital, of which they were very proud. Next. This is a picture of those sisters actually 6 months later, 6 months after they had sent their New Year's greetings. They unfortunately deceased, as well as one of the fathers living at the mission. Next. This is Jean-Jacques Moyembe, a virologist and medical doctor from DRC, and he's the person who first went up to this mission and identified people who had the illness. And actually, next slide, he took one of those persons back to DRC, to Kinshasa, the capital, where she was hospitalized in a private hospital. She did not survive, but while he was up in Yambuku, Jean-Jacques took liver specimens from many of the patients who had died, thought it was yellow fever, and that's why he accompanied this woman back to the hospital in Kinshasa, thinking that this was a disease which was recognized. However, next, he sent specimens from her off to laboratories at CDC in Atlanta, to Porton Down in the United Kingdom, and to Antwerp. And from those specimens, a new virus, feliform virus, was identified, and it was later called the Ebola virus. Next. This is an animal market near Yambuku in the DRC. And next, this is the household of the headmaster of the school at the mission. He had actually bought a live animal at this market and taken it home for his family. His wife butchered the animal and provided it to their children for food. The headmaster himself became sick a few days later and was seen in the outpatient department at the hospital in the mission. Next. And this is him circled in green in the register of that outpatient clinic. He was from Yandongi, which is the town next to the mission, and he had epistaxis, nose bleeding, and he had a dysentery or diarrheal symptoms. He was treated for malaria next with the needles and syringes which were present in that outpatient clinic, and there were only 4 reusable syringes and 2 reusable needles in the clinic. You can also see other equipment, including some maternity equipment. And what happened was, at the time of a delivery, this equipment went from the outpatient department into the maternity. Next. And this is the maternity, just to remind you, in that hospital. So the needles and syringes from the outpatient department went into the maternity every time there was a delivery. Next. And this is the outbreak. The headmaster had received an injection for malaria in the outpatient department. The needles and syringes went into the maternity, and through injection of women who were at delivery, they became infected, as did health workers and then their contacts. And so this was an outbreak that was amplified in transmission by poor infection prevention and control measures. You can see that the hospital closed, and when the hospital closed, actually the outbreak stopped. Next. Now, this is a hospital about 250 miles from the Yambuku site, and this is in Tandala, Zaire, and this is the site of the second outbreak of Ebola. And at this hospital, the doctor had been at the outbreak site in Yambuku, and he knew what Ebola looked like. So when a patient came into his hospital, he immediately isolated the patient, thinking it might be Ebola. And next, what you can see is that that patient did have clinical Ebola, and she died. One of her sisters fit the case definitions. She survived and had antibody, but there was no more transmission in that hospital. Next. A surveillance exercise in that area of Tandala, looking for people in communities who had signs and symptoms of Ebola by workers in each community, identified people who had possible infection, and the doctor at Tandala was notified, came out, did an investigation, took the patient to the hospital, isolated that patient. Next. What you can see is that out of those people, the 98 people who had signs and symptoms of Ebola between 1981 and 1985, 21 of them were actually infected by immunofluorescent antibody with the outbreak, with Ebola. Next. During the first outbreak, during the second outbreak, there were random selection of animals trying to find the vector in nature. And it was very difficult to do this, but there were many, many different animals' organs collected. Next. And all of a sudden, in the pygmies in the Democratic Republic, in Cameroon, who lived in the same basin, Congo Basin, as did the people who had Ebola in Tandala and Yambuku, the pygmies showed that they had antibody to feliform virus. The pygmies, as you may know, are great hunters. Next. And so it was decided to do a search among the pygmies, having them collect their animals on a regular basis. And during a period of 3 weeks, collecting organs from these animals, identifying the animals, storing them in liquid nitrogen to see if the reservoir of this virus could be found. Next. This is a list of some of the animals that came in during that period of time when they were examined by the teams working with the pygmies to identify the reservoir. Next. And this is a telegram that came in notifying the team that actually there were some flying squirrels that had been identified with Ebola antibody. Next. These are the flying squirrel specimens that were collected at this site, and those were found to have antibody to the Ebola virus. Next. Then there was an outbreak of Ebola among chimpanzees in Cote d'Ivoire in 1992. Next. And this outbreak occurred in a study site where a behavioral scientist from Switzerland had been studying chimpanzees for many, many years, over 30 years, and all of a sudden they began to die off. He became very concerned. Next. And had a veterinarian come in from Basel who examined these animals that had been dying. And unfortunately, she became sick herself very soon after she arrived with a high fever and was sent back to Basel, where she came from, to the hospital back there. Next. She was isolated in that hospital, had a disease which at the beginning looked like any other tropical disease, but then became very severe with vomiting, abdominal pain, anorexia. But she recovered. And a few weeks afterwards, the virus from an acute specimen was identified as being an Ebola virus. Next. Chimpanzees then were associated with infection. And again, a chimpanzee was associated with 9 index cases of Ebola among hunters in Gabon. And these hunters actually became infected and infected family members, but it was a small outbreak because they had good infection practices in hospitals and there was no major outbreak. Next. But then there were still studies to be done to see if the reservoir could be found. And so Bob Swanepoel from South Africa turned the experiments around. He took into his laboratory small animals that he thought might be carrying the virus in nature based on studies that had been done in the past and observations. And this next slide shows you Bob holding up a fruit bat because he was able to infect fruit bats in his laboratory. They survived, and he has postulated that they're the carriers in nature. Next. But still, the virus has never been isolated from bats in nature. However, PCR fragments have been found in bat guano at the research center in Franceville in Gabon. Next. And so the hypothesis is that the Ebola virus comes from a bat, either to humans directly or indirectly through through animals, and causes outbreaks in humans. So this is what I had to say. I'll stop now. But what I think is very important is as we study this, we make sure that we work in a One Health environment so that veterinarian, animal health, and human health people work side by side to better understand how these diseases are spread and how we can prevent them in the future. So back to you, Latifa, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Heyman. Well done, 10 minutes. Up next is Professor Mackenzie. Professor Mackenzie, you are muted.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be able to be able to be part of this meeting and to speak to you from, in my case, from Australia. I want to talk a little bit about an outbreak that we had in the Torres Strait between Australia and New Guinea. So a few years ago now, but it is a very good example of One Health in action. This is to do with Japanese encephalitis virus. Next slide, please. Arboviruses generally are very good examples of One Health. Not only are they usually zoonotic with a vertebrate host, but also they're transmitted by an arthropod vector, usually either ticks or mosquitoes, and the virus grows in both the vector and the vertebrate host. Not only that, but the vectors, of course, are very dependent on climatic conditions for breeding, survival, and virus transmission. So climate and weather are also essential components of the ecology. So basically, this is looking at both the environment and the vertebrate host and humans. So there's a very good example of One Health, basically in action. Next slide, please. With, of course, these viruses too, having vectors, these show some of the various factors that really can affect the incidence and the replication of these viruses. And you can see it varies from the weather at the top, strain of virus, lifespan of vectors, density of hosts, and new status of hosts, and so on. So there are very many activities are involved in the ecology of these viruses. Next slide, please. This is just the Japanese encephalitis cycles. There are two cycles. There's what we call the endemic cycle, which is between mosquitoes and waterfowl, particularly our day-ed birds, herons and egrets. But also we have a second cycle, which is probably more important in a peri-urban situation, where the pigs become the major vertebrate host, and of course much bigger than birds, and they can produce far more virus. And this is the one that's most important in terms of the ecology. Next slide, please. Japanese encephalitis is probably still the most important encephalitic virus in Southeast Asia. Generally speaking, we see up to 40,000 cases, or maybe 45,000 cases a year. This is probably just gross underreporting, probably far more than that. We really don't have very good figures. Of these cases, about 25% of them are fatal, and 50% can have severe psychiatric or other sequelae. And only about 25% of the cases fully resolved. Most cases occur in young children in endemic areas. So, as I said, it's a zoonosis between birds, mosquitoes, and pigs. Next slide, please. For a long time, we always believed that Japanese encephalitis occurred mainly in what we call the Asian zoogeographic zone, whereas here in Australia and in Oceania, we had another virus called Murray Valley encephalitis, and that was restricted, we thought, by what we call the Wallace line, which separates the two zoogeographic regions. So next slide, please. However, we had an outbreak of what we thought was Murray Valley initially in 1995 in the Torres Strait, some of the islands between New Guinea and Australia. But much to our surprise, when we did the typing, it was found to be Japanese encephalitis. Here was a virus outbreak with 3 human cases and 2 deaths. And the closest known virus had been isolated in Indonesia, near Jakarta, 3,000 kilometers away. So a major jump between Indonesia and the Torres Strait. So this was really very surprising. We looked at the sentinel pigs. So we put in some sentinel pigs, and sure enough, they got infected very rapidly. And if we looked at the other islands in the Torres Strait, we found 9 of these islands had again, feral pigs, all of which had been infected with Japanese encephalitis. So it was really quite widespread throughout the region. But a second case, a further case occurred in 1998 in the Torres Strait. But also for the first time, we had the first human case on mainland Australia. So this was really a little bit worrying from our doorstep. And we really had to find out more about it. Next slide, please. This just shows where the pigs were in the Torres Strait and between Cape York of Australia and PNG, and they're both the 2 outbreak years. Next slide. But the main thing about this was that pigs were kept by most families in their backyards in very unhygienic enclosures made of corrugated iron. Animals that stood on duckboards over water containing pig waste. Mosquito breeding was rife, both in the pig enclosures and nearby. And horses, although they're dead-end hosts, were allowed to roam freely and around the habitation. Next slide. If you looked at what the mosquitoes were blood meals, what they were feeding on, you see that they're mainly pigs or horses, and humans as well to some degree, and also dogs to some degree. But the pigs were obviously an important component here of the transmission. Next slide, please. So after 1998, we decided to move or persuade the community to move all their pigs to a new purpose-built piggery about 2 kilometers away from the village, thinking this might be a way that we could control the outbreak. Next slide. And sure enough, when we looked at that, now the blood meals and mosquitoes within the community, they're all either dogs, horses, or humans, no pigs at all. So this is obviously had been able to control the incidence by not having any pigs there. If you looked outside the community, 100% of blood meals were in pigs. So this had a major effect in terms of decreasing the incidence of disease. Next slide, please. Where did this come from, this virus? It's the Japanese encephalitis. So we did a lot of retrospective studies in Papua New Guinea, and we found evidence of Japanese encephalitis in sera as far back as 1989. We were able to isolate Japanese encephalitis from mosquitoes in 1997 and 1998 in Western Province, which is the nearest part of New Guinea to Torres Strait. We've also then had 5 cases of Japanese encephalitis found in a hospital near Kayunga. And as we looked for further into this, we found evidence of pig infections in the north of New Guinea, and also way out past Port Moresby to the east of New Guinea, Milne Bay province, where there are cases in humans again in 97 and 98. So it obviously was very widespread now in New Guinea, unbeknown to us here in Australia. Thus, PNG is almost certainly the source of the emergence of the virus in Torres Strait. Next slide, please. This just shows, not showing up very clearly, this just shows the incidence. Okay, next slide. If you keep on going, if you wouldn't mind, next slide. What we think was happening is not going quite in the right directions, but we thought the virus was probably jumping from island to island through the Indonesian archipelago with mosquito bird cycles, eventually coming to New Guinea. But it had done so without being noticed or without being known about. And suddenly, in the late 1980s, here it was in Papua New Guinea, and then in the 1990s in Australia. Next slide, please. This just shows where this human case was in mainland Australia in 98, near the Mitchell River, and not all that far from Cairns, but about 300 kilometers south of the tip of Cape York, Bamaga. Next slide, please. How did they get down there to Bamaga? We believe it was probably infected windblown mosquitoes. At that time, there was a severe outbreak in southern Papua New Guinea. There had been drought. There had been a lot of the water had dried up to small puddles full of mosquitoes, and all the animals would go to those small puddles to feed. Then as a cyclone came through, and a lot of mosquitoes were blown across the Torres Strait and into Australia. So we believe this is how the actual outbreak occurred in the Cape York. Next slide, please. Then once again, JE returned again in 2000. This time was somewhat unusual, but it was a different genotype, quite different to the genotype previously. This one was more similar to isolates from Thailand. And that again returned several years thereafter, and in fact, there's been JE activity now, either in Northern Australia or the Torres Strait, almost every year since that happened. So even up to this year, we've seen evidence of virus activity. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. It just shows how different these viruses are. So genotype 1, you can see the Australian strain at the top there, Australia 2000. And then genotype 2, the ones in pink, or red, should I say, you see both Papua New Guinea and Australian strains are identical pretty well. That was genotype 2. So there's the evidence that the virus came from PNG to Australia is quite clear. Where it came, how it got into New Guinea is supposition, as is the one for genotype 1. But basically, this just shows very clearly how these viruses can cause outbreaks miles away from where they normally occur. So if the conditions are correct and you have the right vectors and the right vertebrate hosts, this can occur very readily. So I give a good example of how One Health is involved with mosquitoes, animals, and humans. And also an excellent example how these things all can happen if all the right conditions occur. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mackenzie. Professor Wang Limfa, you're up next.
Thank you. Yeah, so again, thanks for the invitation. It's a great honor to be in the panel with so many top scientists. So my talk will be simple, just a few slides, just to share this a story of my research. So I titled this "One Health in Action from Hangzhou to Wuhan." So we're in the middle of the pandemic, so most people know where Wuhan is. But for Hangzhou, actually, it's equally famous. We have a virus named after that. Next. So this is kind of my career, so I was not trained as a virologist, but I accidentally got a job in Australia to study virus. And so 1994 basically was the emergence of the virus. Initially it was called the equine mobility virus. And then later, when I determined the genome, I changed the name to Hangzhou virus. So this was really the first deadly virus that we knew nothing. I call them the unknown, and jump out of a reservoir. And retrospectively, we proved that it's a bat-borne virus. So it's already gone through bats to horses and to human. And a few years later, of course, we have this conference in Malaysia, and 98, 99, we had this Nipah virus from Malaysia spill over to Singapore. And that one, pig, is the main intermediate host. A few more years later, then we had this SARS. Now we call it SARS-1, just to, and the SARS-1 was start from Guangdong. And I think that we have quite good evidence to say the ancestral virus is also the bat-borne virus. But in this case, there are a few animals in the markets involved, and the most prominent one is a civet. And then go to Middle East, So what we have the MERS coronavirus, and this one, I think the ancestral virus and the host of the natural reservoir is suspected to be bats, but I think the data was less convincing than the first three viruses. But the intermediate host, or the second kind of reservoir host, we know that the camels in Middle East and to a certain degree in South Africa, Malik's work, there's a similar virus circulating there, but for some reason, spill over to human with diseases has only happened from Saudi Arabia. And then, David already touched Ebola virus, so there are intermediate hosts involved. But for the 2014, so the largest Ebola outbreak, it's still a mystery. There are anecdotal evidence to say it's a direct bat to human transmission followed by human to human. Then we are in the middle of this, the largest pandemic, basically. That's sort of the first outbreak was in Wuhan. The ancestral virus, with 95, 96% identity we have discovered in bats. The question mark is that, was there an intermediate host involved? And if that is, which one? Next. So my personal kind of journey started with the Hangzhou virus in Australia. And then after discovering Hangzhou, as I said, we discovered the Nipah, in Bangladesh, and the Nipah Nipah in Malaysia, and then Nipah in Bangladesh and India first. So in terms of how we can prevent that, especially like in Australia, and only a few human cases, right? To develop a vaccine, some people were saying bomb the bats or develop a vaccine, in bats to control the disease, which is obviously not realistic. To develop a vaccine for human, I don't think any biotech company will come on board. So we came up with this novel idea to say, let's have a One Health vaccine. We develop a vaccine for horses, but we're killing two birds with one stone, right? I mean, some of these horses are expensive. The first outbreak, happened in Hangzhou was racing horses. Each can worth, $250,000. So there is some attractiveness to really immunize horses, to protect horses, but that's not the main aim of the game. The main aim of the game is to prevent transmission. Next. To prevent transmission so that it's a One Health approach. We want to prevent disease and sickness in human. So that was quite successful. Next. And the horse industry and the veterinarians, because the veterinarians are at the highest risk, right? They will, look after sick horses, and that's where most of the infection. So far, we did not have direct bat to human transmission. It's all through horses. And so vets are the front line, and they're at the highest risk. So with really the mobilization by vets and the horse owners and the Australian government really come on board, and they did a very fast track approval. So this called Equavax HI Hanger, the first basically licensed vaccine against BSF4, agent. And this is a horse vaccine, but as I said, it's a One Health vaccine. And, with a little bit of luck, so far so good, right? 2012, before that, we had every other year we have a major kind of outbreak, and sometimes involve human, and we had 8 humans involved, and 7 humans involved, and 4 deaths. But since the vaccine was applied, so far, there's still anecdotal and sporadic horse cases, but no human cases involved. So we like to believe that this One Health vaccine play a role in there to prevent human vaccine. Next. So, I was talking to David before we came on, so that, this idea at least is being contemplated. For most coronavirus, we believe next, the same kind of concept can use next is to, rather than develop a human vaccine, maybe it's more realistic to have a camel vaccine that can prevent the transmission. Okay, next. So I will finish my kind of talk with SARS-CoV-2. To me, I have been in this game for 30-something years on bat-borne viruses. Now we are at a very, very challenging time. Is this possibility of we call spill back? Next. So spill over or forward zoonotic transmission usually means the virus jump from animal to human. We're very used to that. But there is also a possibility when you have a massive human-to-human transmission, you can actually reverse zoonotic transmission, the virus not to the original reservoir host, but to a new host. Next. So we think of the wildlife, animals, the roles they can play in emerging infectious disease. We're very used to natural reservoir, intermediate host, and amplified host. But now we're dealing potentially with spillback hosts and can get to this, what I call unnatural natural host. Next. So it's still being debated, right? The origin of SARS-CoV-2 is a very sensitive issue, but I think, if you want my opinion, I think it's the bats, and most likely in Asia. It goes through animal X. It could be pangolin or something else, and then maybe that adaptation was required before it jumps to human, but followed by massive human-to-human transmission. Next. Now we have so many examples, more than a dozen animals have been proven to be susceptible, and the human pass that to animals. And mink, of course, is the most high profile. Start in Europe. The minks in the farm, the mink farms, you have animal get sick. Next, and the mink, that virus replicate in minks, and there's acquire new mutation that goes back to human. Now that's kind of bad, but it's not the worst scenario because these are farmed animals. As soon as we detect that, and also they got sick, right? So we can control them, using whatever measures. Next, what we're really worried about is, with these spillback or reverse zoonotic transmission, there is a possibility to go to a wildlife animal not farmed and asymptomatic transmission. And we know now, from the bat ACE2 receptor research, there are many more bat species could be potentially susceptible. These are not the rhinoceros bats, which are the natural reservoir. Next, if you get that situation, then the virus will replicate in this new unnatural natural reservoir, and then they spit out new virus and transmit through animals X, Y, Z. Next. And then they can come back, become SARS-3, SARS-4, So when I give this interpretation, I say, it's quite possible that's happening, right now as we're speaking. So the international community really need to work together. And I'm a big fan of serology. I always say, we need to archive animal series of these, susceptible animals, because as soon as this transmission goes, it's very hard. In Asia, for example, very hard to differentiate between the original natural reservoir and this new one I call the spillback reservoir. So with that, I think I can stop here, and thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Wang Linfa. Finally, Professor Paris. You're up, Professor Paris. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Latifa, and it's great to be with my colleagues and with all of you today talking about One Health. So I thought I will start by just putting up this slide. There are many many definitions, explanations of One Health, but this is one I like. So I think the keywords there is optimal health for people, animals, and the environment considered together. So that's one important concept there. And then there is on the top of it, we have the collaborative involvement of multiple disciplines. So as in all these examples that my colleagues talked about, require many different backgrounds, many different expertise to come together. And then there's also the words locally, nationally, and globally. A number of these epidemics that we talked about really are cross borders because viruses, insect vectors, as John Mackenzie pointed out, do not necessarily require visas and passports to move from one part of the world to the other. Now, I'm sure none of us would disagree that this is a great idea. I mean, we should all work together, right? Animal health, human health, environmental sciences. But the reality is that that all of us have our own interests. We first and foremost are comfortable in our own silos. And then secondly, we do have, even unconsciously, territories, if you like, to guard. I mean, let me give you an example. One particular country, I won't name where it is, but I'm sure it's more common than this. If you take rabies control, the control of rabies primarily should be with the veterinary sector. But I know of places where the budget for the control of rabies goes to the human health sector. They're not very happy or willing to release that budget to directly go to the vets who have to trap the wild dogs, sterilize, the stray dogs, etc., and vaccinate them. So there are many things that come in the way of successful collaboration. But I think the examples that my colleagues gave, and I will talk about my own experiences, really highlight the need for that. Okay, so let me go through the next slide. My own experiences with One Health. It started when I was working in Sri Lanka back in the 1980s. Until 1985, Japanese encephalitis, which John Mackenzie has talked about, had been reported occasionally. The whole country, we may have had 10 or 12 cases. And then in 1985, there was a huge outbreak in one hospital, 500 cases in a single hospital serving a particular province, the north central province of the country. So what happened? Why was there this explosion of a disease which previously had been just trickling along? So we studied the mosquito vectors that were there. It was the classical vectors that we trapped the mosquitoes, quantitated them, isolated viruses. There was nothing unusual. It was not some unusual mosquito vector. It was the Culex tritinuricus, Culex gelidus, which has classically been the vectors for transmitting Japanese encephalitis in that part of Asia. We studied the patients, we studied the virus. There was nothing really different. So what had happened? It turned out that in the year or two preceding this outbreak, before that, I should point out that this area is a very heavily rice-growing area, right? And those of you who know about Japanese encephalitis will know that the mosquito vectors, such as Culex tritinuricus, loves to breed in this type of environment. Now, rice paddies, for example. So the vector obviously was there in high abundance, but there had been no disease until then. So as I was saying, just a year or two before this outbreak, the local provincial government, with the very best of intentions, decided to help the rural rice farmer, who is generally, not so affluent, by providing each household with 10 pigs. And that was the spark that lit the whole outbreak. So you can see how a very well-meaning intervention can lead to a major public health problem. Subsequent to that, of course, we did studies across the country to highlight risk areas for Japanese encephalitis, and also to identify areas where the risk for Japanese encephalitis was not so high. Okay, the next slide. My other experience with One Health is avian influenza. As you might know, in Hong Kong, we had a big outbreak of avian flu H5N1 back in 1997. And since that time, we have been working to try to reduce the risk of this spilling over to humans. We know that the source of human infection are these retail live poultry markets. And we also, through studies over the years, showed that what happens is that the virus occasionally gets into these live poultry markets. But once it gets in there, it stays there almost forever, because you have a situation where new poultry are introduced and poultry are removed for slaughter. So the virus has an ideal scenario where non-immune birds are coming in and the virus can continue to survive. So we then introduced interventions. So the only way you can stop that persistence, you can't clean the market as much as you like, as long as the live birds are there. It will not interrupt transmission. The only way you can interrupt transmission is by emptying the market. So the next slide. And this is what we did, and this is over 12 years of work in these poultry markets using a low pathogenic H9N2 virus as an indicator. So we introduced rest days in the market, first 1 rest day a month, then 2 rest days a month, and then in 2008, where we basically had the market empty overnight. And you can see the impact of especially the ban on holding live poultry overnight dramatically reduces the risk of virus maintaining themselves in the markets. And the next slide. And also, from studying the evolution of viruses, of these avian influenza viruses, we were able to show that what happens with H5N1, H7N9, H10N8, all these viruses, they emerge through a common pathway. As you know, influenza viruses have 8 gene segments in them. But many of the gene segments of these viruses, H7N9, H5N1, come from a very common H9N2 virus, which is enzootic in poultry. But they pick up gene segments from wild bird viruses, whether it be H5, H7, H10, and the viruses from wild birds flow into domestic ducks, and from domestic ducks, because domestic ducks and poultry are marketed in the same wholesale marketing chain, that's where the mixing of these viruses occur, and leading to the emergence of some of these potentially zoonotic and potentially pandemic viruses. So understanding that, one can postulate that if you separate the marketing chains of live aquatic birds from live terrestrial poultry, you can dramatically reduce the risk of emergence of these zoonotic viruses. So this is an example of what I call control at source. By understanding the pathways by which, the common pathways by which these viruses emerge, one can take measures that can generically reduce the risk of emergence, even without knowing what the next zoonotic or what the next epidemic virus may be. And my last slide, I think, the next slide, is SARS, and I think Limfa has mentioned this. As you know, in 2003, the SARS virus emerged, spread worldwide, and my colleague Iguan, looking for the place where it jumped to humans, was able to identify these game animal markets, and Limfa mentioned civets and other small mammals, as where the jump to humans took place. And that led to closure of these game animal markets back in 2003, and almost certainly prevented the reemergence of SARS, because the virus continued to persist there even after the human outbreak had been stopped. Later, of course, as Limfa mentioned, the natural reservoir of SARS was found to be these small Chinese horseshoe bats that you see there. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, professors. I'm truly fascinated by each of your personal experiences. I want to ask, based on your personal journey, how has knowledge evolved about emerging diseases? Like, if you are looking through One Health lens, how has your field experiences transitioned from a more silo or reductionist approach or orientation to more One Health? I mean, all of you have been in working on emerging pathogens for a few decades, right? So has the approach always been there, and is it now just re-emphasized, or has it been more reductionist before, but now it has broadened to become more holistic? So perhaps either maybe Prof. Heyman first.
Thanks, Latifa. Well, you know, I think One Health is not really a science, it's a movement. We have to get everybody working together in the same way, under the same type of a movement, and move this forward. And one of the ways that I've been involved in doing this is in a master's course here in London between the Royal Veterinary College and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Each year we have about 30 students who do a One Health Masters. And what's been very interesting over the period of time when this course has been given is that initially it was mainly the veterinarians who participated. But as time has gone on and as more and more people understand the importance of One Health, it's increased its intake of medical doctors on the human side, as well as ecologists and people who work on the environment. So one way of doing that is to get some good educational courses into veterinary schools, into schools of public health, and also into schools where there are ecologists and others learning their trade. Over.
Professor Paris, do you want to share?
Yes, yeah. So I think I'd like to give again my own experience from Sri Lanka. So I talked about this outbreak of Japanese encephalitis that I was thrust into as a young virologist to investigate. Now, as it turned out, at the time when I was an undergraduate, I was a medical student. At that time, the veterinary school and the medical school, the students, we did a number of subjects together, particularly things like biochemistry and sometimes physiology. And that meant that I knew a lot of the veterinary students who had, when the Japanese encephalitis outbreak took place, we had all graduated, and I knew some of the veterinarians in that area as university colleagues. And that actually made a big difference, to help to work together. Now, of course, fortunately or unfortunately, specialization now means that all these professional disciplines have their own faculties, their own schools, etc., which is good, but it loses to some extent the the bridges that need to be built. So I'm a firm believer that we really need to start at the point of undergraduate education. I think it's very important, if we can, even at the undergraduate level, have some joint teaching, joint learning for medical and veterinary students in some common, well, particularly in regard to zoonotic diseases. I mean, that's an excellent learning example where veterinary medical students can learn, these things together. Now, logistically, I know that poses some problems, but I really think it is establishing that type of common interactions and common respect. I mean, it is the fact of the matter is that there are perceptions, there are, one discipline may think, oh, we are superior to the others. The other discipline may think, oh, we are being looked down upon. And these are realities that we have to deal with when we try to combat problems in a One Health concept. So I think we really have to go down, start from the undergraduate stage upwards. And David pointed out, at the postgraduate level, we have great opportunities as well. Over.
Absolutely. I think that communication part is so important, especially if you can do it casually. I think between agencies and between ministries, that would be ideal. Do away with some of the bureaucracy, do away with some of the formalities. I mean, if you can talk to each other just like friends, I think that would really be, you can solve a lot of problems that way. But anyway, do you think that One Health ideas and concept can sustain the test of time, or is it just like a flavor of the decade? For the past decade, all people talk about is One Health. All the international agencies, you have to do this One Health way. You have to use One Health approach. The JEE, the IHR, the PVS, all emphasize on One Health. So do you think One Health can stand the test of time, or people might talk a lot about it now, and then in a few years everybody will forget? And especially, it's true, Professor Heyman, I completely agree. And a lot of my friends make this note too, that One Health has a very strong hold among the veterinary community. Among the medical community, not so much. So what's going on there? And, what's your thought on that, Professor Wang Limfa? You're muted. You're muted, Professor. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to jump in, to talk about that, because, somebody kind of said One Health is basically the vets try to, get in and get a lift the status as medicals, So I think that's a very unfortunate perception. But, John McKenzie, and John can talk about the One Health conference, and we have won the bid. The next One Health conference this November 2022 will be in Singapore. So for this one, we try to really boost a clinic sort of aspects, both the veterinary clinic and the medical clinic. And I was just, to my personal experience, right, the mission to China to really search for the reservoir of SARS-1 and SARS-2. I was in the mission for SARS-1, now 18 years ago in 2003. And so in the international kind of team, we have 8, so-called experts, and I was one of them. And we have 4 vets, okay, and 1 zoologist, Only one really, and she kind of is a human epidemiologist, because we're supposed to go there for animal reservoir. And then the Chinese side, basically, they build up a team of 13 scientists and with 1 vet, okay? So that's already in July. This is not because we don't think animals are important, but I think they want to pick the best scientist. And in those days, they could not find a veterinarian scientist maybe good enough. I don't know. But anyway, that's the fact. So this is something that, I grew up in China there. When I arrived in USA, I was really amazed that, the vet school and the medical school are neck to neck. In China, vet school is when you fail the exam, and then that's the bottom, you go to vet school, right? So that, I think, is in certain culture is very deep rooted. And your question is that, is One Health sustainable? And I say, if pandemic like COVID-19, keep happening, then I think it's a necessity. But structurally and legally and from the government and the international organization, I think we need to have something a bit more substantial. I always say the founding bodies. You look at the founding bodies in every nation, right? NMRC, National Medical Research Council, okay, Australian Research Council, basic science, okay, and animal health funding. There's no such thing, is a sustainable, everybody kind of knows there is a central funding that dedicated for One Health. Not yet. We have anecdotal, small, niche funding, but the mainstream funding is still medical or non-medical. Yeah, so I just leave that. I think the cultural, the funding, the legal framework, I think it need to be improved. But in terms of sustainability, I think, with outbreak like we're ongoing right now, everybody realize that it's a necessity. We have to work together in a One Health kind of sphere.
Professor McKenzie, do you have thoughts?
Yes, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. I think that the education is really, really crucial. both at undergraduate and postgraduate level. But, you know, if you look at what's been happening in the last few years, I do see hopes, shall we say, for sustainability. If we look back a little bit to the SARS and then shortly after that to the H5N1, we saw initially that we saw two outbreaks. First of all, SARS and then the H5N1, with a lot of fears a new pandemic might arise. And so much so, in fact, with H5N1, the United Nations became much more involved with a special United Nations systems coordinator for influenza. We saw also through that the tripartite agreements between WHO, OIE, and FAO, and things look very rosy. Things look, in a sense, they looked as if they might well be taken up by the three organizations, that One Health might kind of become, the silos might be broken down and so forth. But then it seemed to stutter. It seems to go somehow not progress. Little things did. I mean, there were joint meetings on avian influenza, yes, but that wasn't really what we're looking for. We're looking for much more leadership with respect to One Health generally. And I think then, but over the last couple of years, things have changed again. First, a number of things have happened actually. One is that a lot of the big funders have been very active in helping countries set up One Health procedures within the country's national situation, but also that's engendered a whole lot of regional One Health groups, which have been very active, particularly in Africa, but also elsewhere too. But now with the four organizations now, WHO, OIE, FAO, and the United Nations Environmental Programme, they've now set up the new One Health high-level expert panel in One Health. And I have some hopes now that this might lead to much more silo breaking activities at that level, which is also very, very crucial. I mean, we can all understand these things happening at an academic level or at a low level, as people's interests might be. But, you know, we really do need driving and leadership from the top too. And without that, I think things will tend to wither. So if this new development is active and works, and we do see much more activities between the four organizations, then I see much more hope for not only being sustainable, but being a part of the everyday disease public health activities. So I'm confident, more confident now, and certainly believe the next decade or two we'll see far more One Health activities taking place as a general everyday activity. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Mackenzie, Prof. Mackenzie. So I want to pick up where Professor Wong and Professor Paris mentioned just now about veterinary services. And in the tropics, whenever there's budget cuts, not necessarily in Malaysia, but generally in the tropical countries, whenever there's budget cuts or to minimize spending, veterinary services is always among the first one to suffer. You know, just because there's less priorities, perhaps because of miscommunication or misunderstanding among the top management of the country on how important it is, veterinary service to the country and especially to public health. So what would you say to that? What would you say to that? Yes, Professor Paris.
Let me jump in there. I mean, I honestly don't have a direct answer, you know, to budget cuts, but I think, I mean, we talked about education, the importance of that, and I think Limfa mentioned funding, and really, you know, behavior tends to follow the money. I mean, to put it crudely, so we really have to look at you know, the source of budgetary funding as an important driver of One Health. Now, you can influence behavior at the research level. I mean, the research councils, again, of course, we have different councils for human health and animal health and environmental sciences, etc. That's another problem. But that is probably easier to do by influencing research funding with a One Health priority. But when it comes to governmental departments, then we really have a challenge, and I don't have an answer for that. I mean, you know, In many countries, the ministers are different, whether it be agriculture compared to health. So the budget lines are different, and each one is fighting for his or her own territory, right? So it is a challenge. I mean, I agree with what was said. I think John was very hopeful about progress, and indeed we have made progress. But I must say, I'm also pessimistic. I mean, we haven't made as much progress as we would like, and I can see the structural barriers that are preventing, One Health really taking root. Over.
Yeah, so maybe I just add on, I mean, we have a major climate change, conference coming next week, or maybe next month, just 2 weeks from now. This is because we realize the planet is under threat, right? So for me, that for One Health to get to the next level, that the really top level of politicians from COVID-19 have to realize that, a pandemic like this can only be prevented or mitigated using One Health approach. So basically that, emerging zoonotic disease become a threat to the mankind, that level. When you get to that level, then the funding will come in and the policy and the, international collaboration will come in. So I'm still, I'm in between John and Malik, so to say, hopefully COVID-19 is a wake-up call, just like the climate change we have been debating for half a century. And now hopefully after this, when we have real action, and then for One Health, I really think, COVID-19 is a pretty big trigger, and we will see. Yeah.
Tifa, I would also agree with that. And I would think that if we can successfully see a linkage between health security and One Health after the COVID pandemic, that's what will speak to the politicians and the fundraisers. After the anthrax outbreaks or deliberate use of anthrax in the US in 2001, they set up BARDA, which was for research and development. And actually that converted military defense money into research and development for infectious diseases. They were on the US list of agents that could be used biologically to cause harm, but still the research went on, and a vaccine was available then when the Ebola outbreak occurred. So trying to get governments to link One Health with a health security would be very important moving forward, in my view.
That brought me to my next question, and also I think my next question also is being asked by a few people in the audience. All of you have worked with multiple authorities at various countries, including your own. So can you talk a little bit about the challenges of dealing with bureaucracy and politics? How do you engage politicians into the One Health equation? And perhaps, how has it worked for you when talking to politicians to convince them to do something? I can see Prof. Mackenzie is smiling.
Rather cynical smile, I think. I wish I knew the answer, to be honest. To try and get people, to try and raise awareness, raise money at a political level is always very difficult. You can. I guess I think back many years ago when I was a fairly young scientist, I was working on foot and mouth disease in the UK. And we had a huge outbreak in 1968 called the Osmotry outbreak, which cost the country millions of dollars and lost cattle and sheep and goats and pigs and so on that were slaughtered because of foot and mouth disease. And the huge amounts of funding came in to work in foot and mouth disease. But within 4 or 5 years, it had dried up. I mean, political memory is incredibly short. I mean, yes, because the various electorates elect them, and it's a concern in the electorate at that time. But once that's passed, a few years passed, people forget, and politicians particularly. And so I really don't know the good answer for how you can keep that interest up and keep the money rolling in. I really don't know how you can best do that. David might have a better answer than me, I think.
Professor Heyman.
I don't have the answer. All I can say is that you need to use the hooks that you have. And right now that hook is COVID-19, it's pandemics, it's health security, and get the money from the political leaders however you can. And as I said, it may be that they're looking more for defense and linking health with national security, as we've seen is important in COVID-19, may be the answer to get more funding in the long term. But you have to remember that political leaders want short messages. They can't assimilate anything more than short messages which clearly point out to them the importance. So it's really not only just communicating with them, but communicating with them in a style that they can understand, assimilate, and use moving forward. But the real difficulty is that the investments they have to make in One Health are for the long term. And what they want to see is short-term benefits because they want to be reelected. So if you can find some short-term benefits along with a One Health agenda that will make the political leaders be able to show something after 2 or 3 years, you can win on both sides. But it's a very difficult communication to make, in my view.
Yeah, I think David's quite correct. But I think I'm hopeful too, in a sense, that with COVID-19, this is bigger than we've ever dreamt of a pandemic being, in a sense. I mean, even the 1918-19 influenza pandemic, in some ways, is pale in comparison, because of not because of the deaths or cases, but because of the economic consequences. And I think this is going to really drive a lot of people's thoughts for quite a number of years to come, because the economic cost of this current pandemic is absolutely ginormous. Nothing that we've seen in the past would be anywhere near the cost of this one. So hopefully that will be enough to engender the concept, as David says, of health security being a very major issue when it comes to global, not only the global health, but global economies too. Over.
Okay. Yes, Professor.
Sorry, yeah. So I try to, at that security level, David used the term of health security. So when you think of security, the most kind of rudimental we worried about is military conflict, right? So every country has huge defense spending, no matter how, where you are and what kind of risk. So that's kind of in the DNA of every nation, and people are used to that. Defense spending, is that 3% GDP, fine, right? And then, after 9/11 is the terrorist, anti-terrorist, prepared fighting, whether you through electronic, monitoring or do something real, border control, a lot of money. And, most countries have elevated that to a level that we have never seen before. So what I'm remaining hopeful is after COVID-19, now is the third territory is the pandemic preparedness. Basically, as John says already, for the world, if you look at the last, a century, the last 50 years in terms of military conflict, terrorism, yes, the world has suffered a lot, but compare with COVID in terms of everyday life, economic impact, and everything, this has to be the most important, recent historic event. But are we going to have a shift, the mentality funding and the international cooperation to go that way? I think we have to think of that level. Even that level, then we still have to educate, because there are so many people now want to invest in pandemic preparedness, right? And most people are still thinking of a diagnostic and vaccines. But I always say, yes, that's really important. But by the time you need that, it's already in human, right? So the One Health approach is about, evenly distribute the funding so that you can also go to the wildlife, animal, livestock, and then human all together, and also the environment impact, like the climate change. So, I just don't have the cloud, but I hope, somebody at a high level can see that and can mobilize the politician and international agencies, put it at that level, military conflict, terrorism, and pandemic.
There's one question from the participants asking about, for at least in the tropics, human health is under definitely Minister of Health, and then the animal health is usually under agriculture, and then you have a separate ministry that took the portfolio of environment. So these are separate ministries, different culture, different territory, different way of working. So what changes in the policy do you need to make in order to achieve the One Health approach is the question. So what do you, like to change this, to make an umbrella agency, it's gonna be very challenging. So is there an easier way to do this?
Again, I think it's in the political will, right? We had homeland security, never existing before terrorism. So there must be a way of doing it. What we need is the political will and the funding, right? So that reminds me of my SARS mission to China. I would remember I sit there, with the Minister of Health, Minister of Agriculture, and the Minister of Forest, and the Minister of Science. It's really interesting because after SARS, there's a lot of money goes in, right? So then, after Malik, and Guan Yi, the group founded this wildlife involved civics and like that, there's a lot of money go to wildlife. And then everybody want to jump in and say, I can study civics, no problem. I can study, raccoon dogs. And then they try to argue, Minister of Forest said, no, this is our ministry because of wildlife, right? And then the Minister of Agriculture said, no, because it's farm animal now, it should be us. And Minister of Health said, no, this is prevent human disease, the money should come to us. And Minister of Science to say, no, this is basic research, we should have the money. Okay, so when you have the money, every minister says us. And then when they find that, you need to have a policy to regulatory who take the responsibilities, and then the reverse comes to say, that's your ministry because it's not mine, So that, I think, is going to be difficult if we don't have something like Homeland Security can see through the different ministries. Otherwise, Latifa, very difficult because you cannot have one ministry to coordinate with other 2 to 3. Yeah.
There have been some success stories, though, I think. I think, for instance, in Mongolia, the World Bank helped set up a joint program there between the different ministries. So the different ministries would meet on a regular basis to discuss problems in terms of zoonoses and so forth. Yeah. So there have been attempts to try and break down the national silos, and national silos are probably the hardest ones to break down. Mm-hmm. There's one other area that is not researched, not surveilled anywhere near enough. That's wildlife surveillance. Mm-hmm. We have hardly any surveillance internationally for wildlife diseases, and yet this is to me is a crucial weakness we have. We have surveillance for all different various human diseases, but wildlife diseases miss out. And there's hardly any funding for that. There's hardly any political will to do that. And yet, to me, if there's any diseases in wildlife which could possibly cross over to humans, this is something which I think we need to know. And yet we don't have that capacity at this stage to do any surveillance for wildlife.
Right.
Over.
Professor Paris, you've been quiet. I'm sure you have a lot of experience working, especially with the tropical countries. So do you want to share your thoughts?
Well, I mean, as you can gather, I mean, I'm a firm believer and an advocate of the One Health approach. I mean, that has driven most of my activities over the years since the Japanese encephalitis outbreak. But I can see the challenges that we face. I mean, this COVID-19 pandemic was terrible, but it should have been potentially a major driver to change our whole way of thinking in terms of emerging infectious disease, but also broader, I think, as Limfa mentioned, the other issues that we face at a planetary level, including climate change, environmental pollution, environmental degradation, etc. Now, so this should be a mobilizing point that we can use to try to bring attention to all these issues, because I mean, in a sense, all of these are connected with each other. It is human behavior that is driving most of these disastrous outcomes. So I really hope that we can, at a global, political, international level, come together to mobilize public opinion to try to change the trajectory that humankind is on. Over.
Thank you. That brought me to my next point. So, tropical region, we're home of multiple emerging and re-emerging infection because of various reasons, right? Conducive climate, vector abundance, land use change, poverty and human social crisis, and all that. So, but what do you see? I mean, we have so many challenges. So, but what do you see is the biggest challenge of the tropics in controlling emerging infection? What is our biggest challenge? On top of all these challenges?
The biggest challenge to me is to get the research capacities in all countries up to the level that they need to be in order to address these issues. We don't want to see this continue to be the North doing research in the South. We want to see this being research in partnership with the North, but being done by the South. So we have excellent skills in all countries in the South, all lower and middle income countries, very well trained scientists who lack the resources, the financial resources, to do what they could be doing. So we need to somehow make sure that with resources comes the ability for them to do the job, and we work with them rather than for them. So it's what they call in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine a decolonized approach, making sure that we let the people who can do the research the best because of where they're positioned do that research, and we support as best we can.
There have been programs like the USAID's program called PREDICT, which trained a lot of people. Several hundred people have been trained in different countries around the world, in tropical areas. Yet many of them, once the program finishes, will probably find themselves unemployed. So most countries don't have that capacity to be able to put money into either research or into just, shall we say, widespread surveillance processes. So basically, it is a question of really of finance. I think the well-off countries really do owe a lot of support to the rest of the world. It's, as the current DG of WHO says, everyone is important. We can't control this current COVID outbreak unless every country gets immunization. So basically, we can't expect the lower income countries to do this all by themselves when they don't have the resources. We need to help. So I think this is really, to my mind, groups like CEPI and others are there to help to some degree, but we need far more than that. Over.
Absolutely. But how do you think we can change that dynamic? Like Prof. Heyman, you are completely correct. Almost all the tropic emerging diseases occur in the tropics, but a lot of the research, major work is not done in the tropics and not done by tropical researchers. So how do we change that dynamic?
First thing to do is to engage the governments of those countries to provide at least some resources to their scientists, and at the same time making sure that the scientists, if they're trained in other countries, return with some research grants that they can procure the equipment they need and do the research they need in partnership with those who have trained them. So there are many mechanisms that could be developed, but as John says, it takes money, and governments have to make money available. And it's not just the North making money available to the South, it's the South making available money within their own governments as well.
I can give you an example. In fact, I won't say what country it was, but I was visiting one country in our region a few years ago. Well, when I say about 20 years ago, and I was surprised by what good equipment they had. But then I saw past another lab and it was totally empty. And then a second lab beyond that was absolutely jam-packed with equipment, all of which are broken down. There's no one there to repair them. So huge amounts of money were coming in, buying -70 freezers or whatever the country needed for the labs. They would break down, and no one was there to repair them, and so they were left. And so there's a lot of money going in, but it's not necessarily used in the right way. And this is something again which is very difficult to overcome in a sense, because the priorities generally should lie with that particular country, not with the donor necessarily. But nevertheless, when donors' money is coming in, it's not always used as wisely or as well as it could be. It's another problem which is very hard to overcome, I think.
Absolutely.
There's another layer, I mean, David talked about the collaboration North versus South, but I think, I have been in the tropic now for almost 10 years. I think equally important is the collaboration South within, between South and the nations. I think, so when I first came, politically very naive, I thought 10 years ago, I talked to David about this, when you were in Singapore, I said, it's about time to have an Asian center or at least an ASEAN center for disease control. I still very strong believe that, because, each country have, certain advantages and disadvantages, and for everyone to, for example, to have a ABSS3 or ABSF4, I think it's a waste, and it's just like John says, you buy the best equipment and then, not get it utilized. So I think, that's still my view, because the cliche says the virus recognize no borders, and I'm going to add that bats recognize no borders either. So whatever we are doing, it's very similar, right? So if one nation has a strength in that, another nation maybe just by collaborate or go there or coming to the nation. And then if we have a centralized place that all the funding goes there, but the whole nation, the whole region benefits, So I still have that dream. I don't know if I can, mobilize enough people to come on board with that concept. I think in the tropical region, we need some kind of, equivalent of the African CDC type of thing to work together. I mean, even in Europe, we have a CDC, right? So, yeah.
So I'm going to change this a little bit and have you answer some questions from the audience. There's one question here from, I think this is Professor Balbir Singh. He asked, can molecular characterization of infective agents in wildlife, which is great for determining the source reservoir of VID, can really help in predicting the infectious agent that will cause the next emergent infectious disease or pandemic? Okay, who's going to take that?
Maybe can I jump in on that? I'm sure Limfa can talk about this, but yeah, sure. I mean, I think surveillance and sequencing of viruses out there in wildlife is extremely important. But there is one thing that we also should not forget, and that is the capacity to risk assess what we find. Because when we look for viruses out there in wildlife, or for that matter, domestic animals, we are going to find many, many, many viruses. But how do we then identify which are the ones we need to pay attention to? Now, in the case of, if you just take the last influenza pandemic, 2009, we really should have seen the signals in retrospect that swine, the swine viruses, what are called the North American triple reassortant viruses, were a threat. The reason why it was not picked up is not because there was no surveillance, it was because the risk assessment paradigm we were using was imperfect. Now, since then, in the influenza community, we, I think, have made a lot of progress. So the US CDC has this scheme called IRAT, Influenza Risk Assessment Tool. The WHO has a thing called TIPRA, basically. So it's a it's not just a sequence, it's biological characterization of the virus and coming to a systematic risk assessment. So I think both these are extremely important, and we should not forget the importance of risk assessment and only focus on detecting and sequencing. Over.
Yeah, all I can add on is that, I always say classify this as the unknown unknowns. For example, SARS-1, that's difficult, right? Before the outbreak SARS-1, even if we went to bats and found that coronavirus, nobody can do risk assessment. So, but for SARS-2, we have the known unknown. So for SARS-3, SARS-4, then so my answer to the question is, can you use molecular sequencing to predict, the next pandemic? It's like a yes and a no. Yes is for the known unknown, but no is for the unknown unknown. If it's the first time appear, I think we will not be able to do that. But as Mark says, for influenza, I think they are way ahead of coronaviruses. Coronavirus is like maybe the distant second, but in the last 2 decades, the knowledge accumulated versus the century for influenza virus, I think for these two families, I think that it will be not precise prediction which one is going to cause pandemic, but at least can do some reasonable risk assessment on top of the surveillance, as Malik pointed out.
Yeah, I think what Malik says is correct. Because if you look at what happened with Predict, where they found thousands of new viruses, there's only one example that I'm aware of that was actually one that was infectious for humans. That was Bas Congo. I don't think any other viruses they discovered had any particular role in human disease. So being able to find viruses just by stamp collecting, if you will, it doesn't really help unless you have some way of being able to give some idea of the potential for human infection. But I think the other thing too is that it's all very well looking at wildlife, see what there is there, but looking at wildlife that's actually undergoing a disease activity, having an outbreak of something in your local fox population or your even local birds is of some concern. So, but that's not being surveilled at all, and I'm sure that would be much more of a concern, but not only for human health, but also for domestic animal health, for that matter too. We had very little of that's done. But
And I
how
think
molecular studies there would help, I'm not sure.
Go ahead,
I
Professor
think
Hammond.
that, sorry, Latifa, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say that you.
I was just going to say that we have to be thinking out of the box all the time. In Europe, they got rid of rabies by using a baited vaccine that was eaten by the foxes and the carriers of the rabies virus. Why can't we be trying those things with plague, getting the rats that live near domestic households vaccinated with a vaccine that prevents infection in the rats? Or why can't we do that with diseases like Lassa in Africa? We just have to be working in a One Health environment and not just put all our eggs in one basket. For example, as John mentioned, the Predict project, we have to be thinking on all different levels as we move ahead in One Health.
If I can just jump in on to add to something that John was mentioning. So while on the one hand, we are identifying pathogens or potential pathogens out in wildlife, we also need to carry out surveillance on humans at that animal-human interface. So as you probably know, there was this paper that came out recently, which looked at people living in close proximity to bats in large parts of China, and found, not only China, in Southeast Asia in general, found significant numbers of people having antibodies to the Sarbeco-virus related group of viruses. So that means these spillovers are taking place much more commonly than we otherwise suspect. And this comes back to Limfa's point, where he said that he really believes in serology and in novel serology techniques. Over.
There's another question, and this one is addressed to Prof. Wong. Can you please elaborate more on the frameworks on the One Health and pan-coronaviruses vaccine?
Yeah, so so Malik just kind of give the introduction. So
Right.
we found that SARS survivors vaccinated using the SARS-CoV-2 actually protect against the other Sarbeco viruses. So this is one line of very exciting discovery. But equally is that the serology, from China, from Laos, and we have now new data from other Southeast Asian nations to say that actually Sarbeco virus spill over to human more frequently. And in One Health concept, there's always people asking whether people in Southeast Asia have constant exposure to bats. Actually, made them some protection for SARS-CoV-2. Early days, there's always, in Southeast Asia, the transmission is not as rapid and the disease severity is not as rapid. And Antonio Bertolotti from Duke, even in Singapore, he sampled 37 naive non-SARS-1, non-SARS-2, and when he went to T-cell mapping, he found that cross-reactive T-cell epitopes. So all of this are suggesting that maybe in our region, the sarbecovirus spillover and exposure is much more prevalent than we thought, mostly cause no disease or mild disease. Okay, so that we're trying to utilize that to generate the next vaccine to using a cross-clade boost and to get a broad protection, not only against SARS-2, variants alpha, beta, delta, and gamma, but also SARS-1 and anything in between, basically.
I think we're about time, but I'm going to ask one more question, just because I'm the moderator for today. And I really want to ask this because this is of my personal interest. As a female academician and researcher, I cannot help but notice that most prominent scientists in emerging pathogen are males. So, I mean, you are the example of this, right? So what are your thoughts on this, and what can I say to my female friends?
Well, there's one very, very famous Dr. Susan Li from China is a female, She is attract all the world attention to. So, right. I mean, it's not only emerging pathogens, right, in science in general. So that goes back to undergraduate. That goes to role model. That goes to, funding and all the scholarships. So I think that, we're getting better, right? In senior management, like my position right now, I just been given the executive director for the National Pandemic Preparedness, so I pay a lot of attention to that aspect, young scientists,
gender
balance. Yeah.
Okay, so Prof.
I think that's true. I think there's a lot of places where a lot of people actually who are very, very good, who are of the different female. We saw one tonight. Earlier on, I don't know if anyone else was listening, but Rita Colwell was speaking about cholera. Mm-hmm. Rita, I think, is a wonderful example of an absolute top-flight scientist who's had an incredible career. In fact, she's written a book just recently, which I have yet to read, but I'd love to do so. But there are some really, really, really brilliant scientists who are female. The fact that we have a panel of 4 males is probably not a good sign. I think it would be nicer to see a more equitable gender. But these things happen, I guess.
Right. Professor Thayman.
Latifa, that in the future there will be many, many more women. Women now are dominating in medical schools, in many veterinary schools, and it's just going to take time, and it's going to also require that these women are willing to put themselves in the position to have an opportunity and to take advantage of that opportunity. Because it doesn't just come because you're male or female. It comes because you put yourself in the right situation, you prepare yourself, and you take advantage of the stepping stones that lead to a career. So it's not just a matter of being male or female, it's a matter of making sure that you're in the right place at the right time.
I think that you're quite right. Most of the students I've seen come through over recent years have been female. But 80% of the students doing microbiology in Australia are female. And this is beginning to show up now more and more in academic appointments and more in terms of research grants and so on. So I think this is just a question of time. I think it's going to change and change dramatically over the next decade or so.
Okay, on a final note, I want to say that many years ago when I was a student, I attended a talk with Dr. Robert Webster. And at that time also, the very young Dr. Paris was speaking. And in that, he said that, Dr. Webster actually said that every 20 years or so, the world will suffer a major global disease outbreak that will result in significant morbidity and mortality. In the past 2 decades, we have seen multiple emerging diseases, and very fortunately, relatively, did not reach truly disastrous scale, but I think our luck ran out with COVID-19. or perhaps we are still lucky because the case fatality for COVID-19 is still comparatively low compared to things like Ebola, Nipah, Lassa. So my question is, as a conclusion, what is next after COVID-19? And how do we prepare ourselves? Maybe I'll go around one by one. Professor Heyman.
Well, we have lots of known threats, and we have to deal with them as well as be prepared for the unknown. And the unknown threats that may be very important in the future are, for example, resistance to antibiotics. And if we don't get the vaccines we need to prevent the infections, which need to be treated today by antibiotics, we're going to fail in our attempt to control antimicrobial resistance, because the agenda now is new anti-infective agents. That's important, but it's also important to concentrate on vaccines for bacterial infections and for parasitic infections, especially with the new vaccine platforms.
Professor Mackenzie.
I would echo with what David just said. I think it's some of the known viruses we have are very much a concern, like Nipah. If Nipah is able to transmit more readily and by the respiratory route, and I think, to my mind, it maybe take only 1 or 2 mutations, and that could be quite a really dangerous virus, causing with pandemic potential. But I think it's the unknowns, which are in some ways are the biggest threat, I think.
Professor Wang.
Yes, I used to say another bad coronavirus, but COVID-19 is it's a double-edged sword. I mean, we're all suffering, but for the first time in mankind, that the whole world population be vaccinated within a space of 2 to 3 years, at least to 50 to 70%. So that actually, I think we'll be preventing another major disaster of another cybernetic virus, because they offer some kind of cross protection. So I agree that, now I will change my prediction to say the next one will be like a more in the unknown kind of territory if you're dealing with a virus. And the AMR, of course, is a given.
And Professor Paris?
I think if you go back over the last 20 years or so, we have humankind, we have dodged one bullet after the other. So we had SARS, which was quite severe and it spread quite efficiently, but because of various characteristics, it was able to be controlled. We had this, the H1N1 pandemic, which spread very rapidly, but fortunately was very mild. Then we had the Ebola, which is severe, but because of its mode of transmission, it is containable. And of course, we have COVID, and we are all, very upset about it. But I think we cannot be complacent, or imagine that the next pandemic will be even as relatively mild as COVID-19. As I think somebody mentioned, COVID-19 is probably definitely not the most severe of viruses. So I think we really have to be prepared for things that are even much worse than COVID-19. And all the more reason why we should really put our shoulders to the wheel and be better prepared.
Absolutely. So we have come to the end of our session this evening. I want to thank all the panelists. You guys have been fantastic. I mean, such fascinating conversation with you. And I'm truly, truly very privileged today to be moderating this session. Thank you for chatting with us today. Thank you, audience, if you are still on, for staying with us till the end. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.